Today we are talking with John Seabrook, the author of The Song Machine, Inside the Hit Factory. Welcome to Redera.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you. The book is fascinating and it focuses on enormous changes that are going through in the music industry. But you have done very meticulous research in putting together what it takes to make a hit. Can you give us a little bit what is the focus, main kind of central focus of the book or central theme of the book?
The central theme of the book is the way in which the creation of songs for radio, hit songs, has gone from sort of a cottage industry or a sort of a craft process where there was one or two people involved to an industrial process where there are larger numbers of people involved and they create the songs in a different way. And it makes the songs different, and there are certain people that do it very well, and those people are the focus of my book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How the industry has evolved in the last 10 years, especially with the emergence of internet, or rather the industry has adjusted to it?
Well, the music industry has been uniquely challenged by the digital age, in that it's sort of been they say the canary in the coal mine, or the pioneer. Its whole means of distribution shifted from a brick and mortar to online before anyone else's did, and it's the actual commodity itself changed at least twice, from a CD. Well, you can go back before that, from vinyl to CD to MP3 to stream, but particularly from CD to MP3 to stream, that all happened, in the last 20 years. So that's a huge amount of change. So it's adjusted to it. Maybe it could have done better. I'm sure it could have, but it's the first step to deal with a lot of these problems.
Mm-hmm. By one estimate, the industry at one point at the peak was almost over $27 billion, and now it's almost near the half of it. So obviously, a lot of flexibility, financial flexibility or traction that was there is no longer there.
Yeah, well, the music business still hasn't recovered from download, the rise of Napster and the rise of the peer-to-peer music, the distribution networks, and then iTunes, and now Spotify and Apple Music. They're all trying to sort of get a grasp on how to make money from digital distribution of music, and so far no one's figured it out really that well. People are making real money from streaming. Spotify has paid out something like $3 billion, but it's not even clear that Spotify is a sustainable business, because it pays out so much money and has to pay out 80% of its, revenues to the labels. So the value has decreased, and it's an ongoing struggle to figure out how to increase.
Before the digital age and before even the large-scale studios got involved, how the hits were created? I think you went through that quite a bit in the detail. As you said, it was a craft, and the craft involved few people and things like that. Maybe you can draw some example that will help listeners to understand.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they think of pop music, particularly people of a certain age, older than 50, think about music that was written in the Brill Building era by Burt Bacharach and Carole King and others of that era, and then the songwriters who had been part of what was loosely called Tin Pan Alley before them. They all had a certain way of writing songs, which basically involved two people and one was the word person, the lyric person, and the other person was melody person. And they would sit at a piano and write a song. And then if it was a good song, somebody would arrange and produce it and eventually record it. And that's how songs were created for a long time. And as I was saying, the central, I think, thesis of my book is that process has fundamentally changed, and it's turned into what I call, instead of a melody and lyrics process, it's turned into what I call in the book a track and hook process, which we can break down and discuss. But that's basically the way songs are made today, in which there's a track that is the beat. It always starts with a beat, and the beats are always electronic. They're made on computers. It's pretty easy to make a beat. Not that easy to make a good one, but you can start with a beat, and using the computer, you can create quite elaborate track yourself, and that's what a lot of producers do. You don't need musicians, and then once you have a track, you need a hook. So because you need two things, you need your track and you need your hook, and the hook is the melodic part. Because without the hook, the track is just background music. It's like just not even disco. It's like just not even elevator music. So you need the hook, and so the producers then get people who know how to write hooks in, because the people who do the tracks only very rarely can also do the hooks. So you get a hook person to come in. So instead of a melody and a lyric person, you have a track and a hook person, and then after the hook gets put on the track, the lyrics are added. So the lyrics sort of come last rather than first, or at least second, and that's a big change too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe you can take one of the examples that you have in the book, and then what it goes in making a kind of a hit that gets very popular. And of course, the hits, it's all about making hits, but then you go through many failures along the way as well. So, and probably the economics of that has all changed dramatically as well.
Well, yeah, the book covers a period where the music industry was at its peak in the 90s. The first part of the book takes place in the 90s, when the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and Britney Spears are all rising thanks to the songs written by the Swedes, who I focus on in the book, in particular this guy Max Martin. And the important thing there is that it was an R&B sound. They were white groups, particularly Backstreet Boys, but also sort of NSYNC. But they were looking for kind of a black sound, and they couldn't really find it in America, because in America, the white sound and the R&B sound are farther apart, I think, because of the racial underpinnings of everything in America, whereas in Sweden, they heard white and R&B more as just music. And I think we're able to come up with a kind of a hybrid sound. So it was like a white pop sound, but it has more of a beat than the typical, like ABBA. If you want to compare it to ABBA, it was a little bit more. I mean, ABBA had a lot of synthesizers too, but it had a little bit more of a kind of a melodic side to it, I guess. Top line side to it. But and so that's a big change, I think, that the Swedes that I write about in the book were able to bring into American culture through the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears. And then, that whole way of that sound, I mean, it's a change. It's also added a kind of a rock element, and in later on with Katy Perry, the same people worked with Katy Perry and created those songs. but it's created a template for writing songs, songs written not just in the track and hook method, but also songs written in a kind of committee method where you have a lot of different people who are writing on parts of the song, and they get swapped around a lot. It's also, of course, notable that the internet has not only revolutionized song consumption, it's also revolutionized song creation, because you can collaborate with almost anybody now. You don't need to be in a room with them. And collaboration is so integral to music creation that I think it's opened a huge number of doors and kind of enabled those that are good at collaborating. And the Swedes seem to be good at that. And that's the way, if you look at, actually I was looking at Billboard last week. If you look at, it's probably the Beyonce song "Sorry," which is on her new album Lemonade. If you look at Billboard and look at the songwriting credits, there's so many songwriters credited that the print is so tiny that you can't read any of the names. At least I couldn't. Yeah, songwriting has definitely changed.
Yeah, and I think songwriters are one of the people in that industry who probably don't get compensated the way they should have been or could have been, and that could impact going forward how this hits the creators.
Yeah, there's a part of the book, and I've been doing more stuff about this lately, about how the way that royalties are paid in a streaming situation is very different from the way royalties are paid in terrestrial radio. And terrestrial radio, which was set up back in the 30s and the 40s, when radio was fairly new, the rules were created then, favored the people with who were the songwriters, the people who own the copyright to the composition of the song. The publishing side of the song were favored in the royalty arrangement, and then the people who own the recording copyright, which is like the record made from the song, which is usually the labels, were not favored. So in terrestrial radio, you can make a lot of money as a songwriter if your song gets on a top 40 radio, but the performer and the record company isn't making anything except for the promotional value of the record, which is the logic. Of the radio, which is the logic behind the whole arrangement. But at any rate, in the streaming world, when the streaming rules were kind of slyly created, the labels didn't make the same mistake again, and this time got like 80% of the revenues, and the publishers only get, people with the publishing, which is the songwriters, the publishers only get 20% or less, and so the amount of money that they make from streaming is far less than it is from radio. But the argument is that streaming pays out over a much longer period, and it also brings new listeners that radio might not bring to people, and it enfranchises a new kind of musician who can make money in the streaming world. But so far we haven't really, those exist, I don't know about them. You see a lot of musicians that used to make money by selling CDs, because in the 90s, going into the 2000s, that was a great time to be selling CDs because a lot of people were buying them. But once Napster hit and, file sharing, that whole it was sort of a bubble. Because it's not like musicians have made a lot of money historically from selling recorded music. It really was only, this a little bit of vinyl and CDs where like these giant revenues were made. And now it's kind of gone back to touring and much less revenues from recorded music, but it's definitely made it harder for a lot of sort of middle class musicians to survive, and for songwriters who can't tour, if they don't tour, I mean, if they're not artists, those then they don't have any choice. They don't have an option except for their royalties. So that's the people that are particularly vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. You explore the character in the book, Max Martin, the Swede, who has several, almost 30 top 10 hits since almost in the last 12 years. What is this about that they know or they do well, that the Max Martin and the people in Sweden can do this a better job than others?
Well, I think the Swedes do have certain advantages that makes it somewhat more statistically likely that they would succeed in this particular field, because it requires certain skills that Swedes are pretty good at. One is, of course, it helps to have musical training, and the Swedes have good musical training in schools, and they get music lessons, they get loans of instruments from the government. It's very easy to pursue an interest in music in Sweden because it's, sort of a socialist country. So that's one reason. The second reason is the technology of making music today. Everything is made on computers. It's music is programmed more than it would be played. When it comes to actually making a song in a studio, it's much more likely that you, the songwriter, will be sitting in front of a computer programming the song than sitting in front of a guitar playing the song, because that's just how songs are made. And Swedes are also very adept at technology. They get it, again, in school. The infrastructure, broadband is very good. So they're good at that. So that's another thing. I think they're good at working in groups. I think in America, there's much more individualism involved in the whole music business. It's very much star-driven, kind of, and it's also very money-driven. There's a lot of hustlers who are in the music business only really because they're good at like hustling money. And in Sweden, you don't really get that as much. You get people that are in it for the music, I think. Of course, they want to make some money, but it's a different attitude, and I think it makes it better in the long. That's why they survive longer. That's the third reason, and then the fourth reason, as I mentioned earlier, is this unique crossover between R&B and pop, which allows them to make this new kind of pop music, which has become the pop music, over the last 20 years. But it's much more like disco, I think, than pop music in the 60s or 70s, where there's a much clearer divide. Again, it has to do with computers, really. I think drums are not real, quote unquote real. They're made on computers, or you use drum machines to beat on or to create the beat on, and that gives the music a very different feeling. And it is a big change, that's for sure. The fact that the music that we hear on the radio today, almost all of it is made on computers with hardly ever an instrument involved, is a fairly astounding fact. It bears underlining once in a while, just because it's not clear to me that people are aware of that. And that has happened over that's kind of happened over the period the book covers, and it's continuing to develop further and further. I think the music on the radio today, the hip hop music, using a lot of strange computer effects and stuff, and I guess influenced by EDM, and all of those guys. The computer has just become more and more a part of the whole music making process. That's a huge change.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the book you bring up the importance of mega hit, that how important that have become across the entertainment industry. And I think you kind of throw some numbers in the book that are very fascinating that almost 13 million songs were available and less than 50, close to 50,000 make up almost 80% of the revenue, and 10 million of those 13 million tracks did not even sell a single copy.
Yeah, it's still another theme in the book is whether or why the hit-making approach to the music business, where everything is sort of driven by hits, why that approach has survived the digital age, which seemed like, at least earlier in the 10 years or so ago, seemed like was going to bring a more democratic way of distributing fame, even that you wouldn't have to have just a few artists who have mega hits, that you'd be able to have a larger pool of artists that would have, sort of medium hits, and you could figure out how to sustain it economically, and that this would create what was, what was called the long tail, which was the name of a book about 10 years ago. It was published, and it was a popular concept that there was a long tail of, the leading metaphor was that the brick and mortar world is a world of limited shelf space. So you only have the space to display 10,000 books or CDs. And so you really want to display the 10,000 that are selling and not the ones that are just sitting around. And so that's why, and the rest were basically impossible to get. So it was a hits driven economy based on the sort of limits of retail economy that brick and mortar imposed, and then once you went to internet economy, you didn't have those limits anymore, and therefore it seemed like it would be possible to have like economies of scale that would work for lesser hits, and you wouldn't have the limits that were imposed by shelf space, so you could have the same status as people that were sort of quote unquote in print or whatever, and that would drive a more level playing field. But in fact, that doesn't seem to have happened at all. In fact, you can argue that something like the opposite has happened, that hits have become more important than ever, and that the playing field is continued to just be a less and less level when it comes to being able to sustain it in the music business.
Mm-hmm. And the making of hits have survived even the severely disruptive forces that were unleashed with the rise in acceptance and development of internet.
Yeah, I think the reason they survived is because what the long tail people didn't really appreciate is that the internet unleashed a bunch of different forces in different fields that were kind of felt in different ways, and yes, it did create infinite shelf space. So Amazon has everything, and and in retail that has had an enormous effect, but in social media, the force of the internet has been, I think, toward consolidating hits rather than kind of leveling the playing field. Because in social media, you really only have a little bit of time. You don't know that many. You might not know the person all that well you're communicating with, and you talk about the same stuff that everybody else is talking about. Whatever, the Justin Timberlake video this week, and or the Rihanna, whatever it is, and I think that force, which is also an internet-driven force, has actually had the effect on making hits more and more part of the whole economy. So I think there's like the sort of conflicting forces at work, but overall, the internet it seems to just sort of spread the basic feeling that everybody has to, if there's something big, really big, then everybody can know about it. And that's true of whether it's 9/11 or something. Of course, that doesn't need the internet maybe, but, or the woman who put on the Wookiee mask, over the weekend, who I now know about. I don't know if you watched you might not have seen it, but she's now on television, and she's, it's a viral video of this woman laughing, because she puts on this Wookiee mask, and it's very funny. So that can happen too. Some of that ground was actually covered in my book Nobrow, which I wrote in 2000, not about the internet per se, but about how these sort of viral things can become dominant fairly easily.
Yeah, yeah. How do you think it's going to shake out in the near future, as the internet and social media are becoming more and more now the norm rather than new technologies?
I think in the long run, artists, and I'm going to sort of address it from the point of view of what I would like to see. You'd like to see artists figuring out how to make use of the new economy of streaming in a way that puts it to their advantage. I don't think that's happened yet because of the way streaming has been kind of introduced to the world through kind of technologists who maybe they see the future clearly, maybe they don't, but they're so far ahead of the artists that they just have trouble, I think, communicating that vision. And so far, the artists, I think, feel like they've been kind of left out of it, and it's their enemy. But you kind of hope that, like, the next generation or something, people growing up with it as natives will figure it out and use it to their advantage, and that it'll be a golden age. Because the good news about the digital side in terms of money is that it makes it possible to collect in a much more precise manner. And there's a lot of money that just doesn't really get collected at all. Music is used in all kinds of different ways across the internet and websites, and you're supposed to pay every time you use it. And of course, it's listened to for free. And I think over time, all that stuff's going to get better monetized, and it's going to become global too, so that again, a lot of the way the payment societies, they're called, are set up, the societies that collect for artists, collect royalties, they're very bound by territories and by nations. So there are many different collection societies in the world. In Europe, you have countries that have 2 or 3. The United States has 3, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. And there a lot of these are very old and do things in a very old-fashioned way and haven't really been able to digitize in the way that they need to compete, and that you're now seeing a new class of companies that are sort of digitally native, that started out as technology companies like Cobalt, which is a publishing and collection company, that are springing up or growing bigger. And I think that's going to be the long-term future of all of this, is a more full merging of the technology side and the music side, the creative side, which up till now and continuing, I think, have viewed each other with a lot of mistrust. The relationship is based on, I think, the music business not understanding the implications of CDs and making digital tracks and how easy they would be to copy, and then feeling kind of taken to the cleaners by the technology people on that stuff. And then I think even with Apple, and which is their first big dealing with the technology industry, I think the music business ended up feeling taken to the cleaners by Steve Jobs because he made them accept the standard of the 99-cent single, and that broke up the album, and that really disemboweled the profits that albums brought, because you could sell them for $15 or $12, and they didn't cost that much to make, and CDs of course cost very little to make. But once you had singles, then you could just buy the singles. You didn't need to buy the albums, and that was all gone. And so, and then of course Napster, and even now you see Taylor Swift and Spotify, or and now you've got Tidal. So all of that is an ongoing negotiation between the creative side and the tech side. But I guess it's going to just have to keep getting better, and it will, I think, as time goes on. And hopefully that'll help artists. I think it will.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your comments. We have been speaking with John Seabrook, the author of The Song Machine Inside the Hit Factory. Thank you very much once again for your comments.
Okay, thanks.